For 800 years, a magnificent abbey towered over the town of Evesham, a monastery that in its prime was one of the finest in the land. It grew from humble beginnings as an early Saxon church into a wonderful array of ecclesiastical buildings, few of which remain today. But if we look at the medieval buildings that do remain, we can begin to picture the magnificence of the former abbey, which led directly to the founding of the ancient market town of Evesham. As Abbot Lichfield, the last true abbot of Evesham, built his bell tower and made the final embellishments to his beloved abbey, so Henry VIII's commissioners were preparing to close the monastery down. On January the 30th, 1540, during evensong, the commissioners moved in, and the monks were turned out of their monastery, never to return. By October that year, most of Evesham Abbey had been demolished, the best stone having been pilfered or sold. But for some reason, no one really knows why, the bell tower was spared. It is thought it may have been bought by the townspeople, or spared by Sir Philip Hoby, to whom the abbey lands were given. Today, the bell tower remains almost as it was when Abbot Lichfield built it. As you can see, the fan-vaulted ceiling was never completed, the springers being clearly visible. From the bell tower you can follow the stepping stones which mark out the walls of the great abbey church, which was dedicated to St Mary and St Egwin. Today, the site of the high altar is marked by the memorial to Simon de Montfort, killed at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Beyond this, you can see the remains of the abbey fish pools, stew ponds, where the monks kept a ready supply of fish. Fed by a natural spring, today they are converted into lily ponds and herb gardens. The stones lead on to the site of the chapter house, built by Abbot John de Brookhampton, who, in 1282, embarked on an elaborate programme of building. This was a truly remarkable feat of engineering, and is said to have been the finest chapter house in Europe. It was a 10-sided, vaulted building, about 50 foot in diameter, without a central pillar. It had glazed windows and was wonderfully painted and adorned with gilded bosses. The richly carved arch led through to the cloisters, the foundations of which were dug up in the 18th century and burnt for lime. The old abbey lectern, which is carved in the manner of the capitals of Wells Cathedral, was also excavated at this time, and is now to be seen in Norton Church. During the 11th century, Lady Godiva was a frequent visitor to Evesham Abbey. Her husband, Earl Leofric, was one of the 4 great earls of England and a commander in King Canute's army. He helped to restore Hampton and Bengeworth to the abbey, which had previously been lost to the Danes. The chronicles record that Godiva and Leofric built a church in Evesham dedicated to the Holy Trinity. It has been suggested that Lady Godiva's church could have been the medieval St Peter's Church at Bengeworth, dismantled in 1872, with now only the 13th century porch and tower base remaining. This is directly opposite King Canute's Manor, the oldest house in Bengeworth. It was around 1070 that 2 monks from Evesham, Rhinefrid and Elfwy, joined up with Prior Aldwyn of Winchcombe for a remarkable mission to refound the monasteries at Jarrow, Wearmouth and Whitby, which had been devastated by the Danes. It was the vision of these monks from Evesham that led directly to the founding of Durham Cathedral, Fountains Abbey and St Mary's, York, which the Evesham chronicles record as being linked to Evesham as if it were a single body and a single church. Walking back along the abbey wall, you come to Abbot Reginald's Gateway, a fine piece of Norman work dating back to the 12th century. At the time, it was part of a fortified boundary to the abbey precincts, but later this gateway led to a thriving marketplace, a market which survives today. It supplied the abbey and townspeople with all their needs, and beneath lay a labyrinth of tunnels, most probably used as cellars for cold storage. Abbot Reginald, who was installed at the abbey in 1130, also built the nave, William Littleton, a monk who survived into the 17th century, described the nave of Evesham Abbey to the antiquarian Thomas Habington.
The great abbey church contained 3 aisles of more than ordinary breadth, extending from the gatehouse, now standing eastward, almost to the new tower, having cloisters answerably to the south side, together with walks and courts for the recreation of the monks, with a very great and curious walk to go at certain times to the little church to celebrate Mass, which church is now the parish church of St. Lawrence. All which abbey and cloisters were of curious workmanship, and had within side 164 gilt marble pillars, all in so many chapels dedicated to their respective saints.
The 2 churches within the abbey precincts were built by the monks of Evesham and date back to the 12th century. All Saints was built for the use of the townspeople, and St. Lawrence's for visiting pilgrims. As well as building the bell tower, Abbot Lichfield added the chantry to St. Lawrence's church, as well as the porch and chantry at All Saints, where he is buried. Now we come to the remains of the Great Western Gate, once a magnificent entrance into Evesham Abbey. Enlarged by Abbot Cureton in the 14th century, it consisted of a range of crenellated buildings, with fan-vaulted archways, towers and an integral chapel, the exterior being richly adorned with niches and statues of the saints. Looking at the walls at the rear of the Abbey Gate, you can see traces of the Great Arch, and other remnants of the fine medieval building it once was. The arches you see at the northern end of the range are possibly remnants of even earlier gateways, while above you can see the remains of a fine Gothic arcade into which 18th century windows were installed. Today, as you can see, the building has been restored and turned into luxury apartments. In the present-day gardens, behind the Great Gate, there would have been an abundance of conventual buildings, including a bakehouse, brewhouse, the Abbot's Hall, visitors' accommodation, stables, and much more. Buildings described by the antiquarian Thomas Habington, which would have been on a par with those at Oxford and Cambridge. Other traces of Abbot Cureton's work remain along Boat Lane in Evesham. He enclosed the Abbey Barton, farmlands, with a strong high wall, which led down to the River Avon. Here you can see traces of the wall, part of it at almost its original height. And from here we see the hand-drawn ferry, similar perhaps to the one used by the monks to carry their casks of wine across the river from their vineyards beyond. It was from the almonry that relief was administered to the poor. Today, Evesham's Museum and Heritage Centre houses some of the abbey remains and archaeological finds. To explain more about these are 2 of the Vale of Evesham's knowledgeable tour guides, Helen Piper and Tony Whiting.
We have here the Great Abbey Bible, Tony.
Yes, it's a very interesting document. It's one of the first printed English Bibles, dated 1537, and I think you've got some very interesting information about the use of English Bibles during the time of Henry VIII.
Yes, I've always been surprised to see an English Bible here. Henry VIII, having reformed the church, still didn't really approve of Bibles in English. And it is a known fact that his second wife, Anne Boleyn, had an English language Bible in her room and encouraged her ladies-in-waiting to read it, despite Henry's disapproval.
Well, that's very interesting. The other very interesting thing about the book, of course, is the fact that in the Bible itself there are pages where one of the monks, John Alster, has actually written little notes, bits of music, and that particular page that's open there, it explains what actually happened at the time of the dissolution of the Abbey.
And the year of our Lord 1540, the monastery of Evesham was suppressed by King Henry VIII, the 31st year of his reign, the 30th day of January, at evensong time. The convent being in the choir at this verse, de posuit potentes, and would not suffer them to make an end. Philip Ballard being abbot at that time, and 35 religious men at that day alive in the said monastery.
So that makes this Bible a priceless artefact and a unique account of an actual act of closure.
Very, very special. I understand it is one of the only first-hand accounts of the actual moment of dissolution of one of our abbeys.
In 1811, Squire Rudge, who by now owned the abbey site and much land around Evesham, began excavations of the abbey. At the same time, he began building a magnificent manor house. His wife, a talented artist, made meticulous records of the finds, and many of these features provided inspiration for the building of their beautiful home. In and around the house, the squire exhibited remains of the abbey, including gargoyles, window tracery, the great pillar bases, and 2 of the abbot's coffins, one of Abbot Henry, who died in 1263, and whose remains were exhumed during the dig. The other coffin, also found, contained the bones of an aged man, with a seal from Pope John the 22nd within the fingers, which indicated these could be the remains of Abbot Kiriton, who built the great gate we saw earlier. In the grounds of Abbey Manor, Squire Rudge also built the Leicester Tower and an obelisk to commemorate the Battle of Evesham, which took place close by, in a field known as Battlewell. It was here that on August the 4th, 1265, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, was killed, fighting for his belief in representative government. It is said Simon died near a spring, which later became a place of pilgrimage and healing. Today the spring remains, surrounded by a wildflower meadow and lush fields, its peace and tranquillity far removed from that dreadful day in 1265, which was described by Robert of Gloucester as the murder of Evesham, for battle it was none.
Particularly appropriate that the abbey remains are in this room, because this room contains a fireplace commemorating the marriage of Prince Arthur, the Tudor Rose, to Catherine of Aragon, the pomegranate. This innocent marriage led through 25 years of marital discord with Henry and Catherine of Aragon to the closure of the Great Abbey.
Well, here, Helen, we have a most beautiful model which was presented to the museum in 1974. It was made from records of the abbey, showing the dimensions and the style of the abbey. We can't be absolutely certain that that was the style of architecture, but bearing in mind the period where the various parts of the abbey were built, we have a pretty good idea of what it would have looked like.
One of the more gruesome artefacts in this room is this skull. Could this be one of the abbots of Evesham, Tony?
No, in fact it isn't. I've got no proof of this, but my own theory is that it may well be the skull of Simon de Montfort himself, or at least one of his sons.
This is a beautiful artefact, Tony, the great chair. Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Yes, it was actually made in about 1340, and it belonged originally to Bishop Len, who was one of the bishops of Worcester. Eventually it was acquired by one of the abbots of Evesham, and after that the coat of arms of the abbey were applied to the back. It's a beautiful piece of furniture. It's known as a pontifical chair, which is another word really for a throne, and it's got some allegorical figures actually carved in it. You'll see a monkey at the top. Over on the arm there you'll see a hare. In the corner there we have an owl and a little bird on the other side. It's quite a large chair, as you can see. I don't know whether you want to try it.
The chair is absolutely vast, Tony. Were the abbots rather portly gentlemen?
Well, I'm sure there were some abbots that were extremely portly. They lived very well, the abbots, but that isn't the whole purpose of the size of it. You are thinking in terms of a prince of the church who would be surrounded by beautiful silk cushions. He would be vested in beautiful brocade vestments. And really the whole thing was supposed to portray to the people that this was an important man. He was the head of the abbey. He was a prince of the church.
So what actually led to the founding of the great abbey at Evesham? Legend tells it was a vision seen by Eof, a humble swineherd, around the year 702, and today commemorated by beautiful stained glass windows in St. Lawrence's Church and a sculpture in the marketplace. The chronicles record that as Eof tended his pigs along the banks of the river Avon, he saw a brilliant light among the trees and 3 beautiful maidens singing. This wild and wooded place, called Hom, belonged to Egwin, Bishop of Worcester, and when Eof had the vision, he called the bishop to the place, which became known as Eof's Hom. He too saw the vision of the maidens standing either side of the Virgin, who blessed the bishop, saying, Ecce locus quem elegi, this is the place I have chosen. And Egwin resolved that a great church should be built upon the site. By 708 the church was almost complete, and Egwin journeyed to Rome to gain support from Pope Constantine I. The following year royal grants of land were confirmed at the Council of Ulster, and the abbey church was consecrated by Wilfrid, Bishop of York, on the Feast of All Saints, 1st of May, 709. Among the manses granted to the abbey at this time were farms at Norton, Offanem, Badsey, Honeybourne, Willesey and Littleton, whose beautiful tithe barn has been restored by the National Trust and is one of the few that remain in the villages today. The Benedictine Abbey went on to become a place of great fame and pilgrimage, until that fateful day in 1540, where Henry's commissioners moved in, and the monks were turned out of their beloved abbey, and the great doors were slammed shut forever.